Snow had been falling on the fells since noon, and by the time the last carriages came grinding up the long avenue to Velmont Hall, the whole valley lay under a silence as deep as the grave. Inside, the great hall blazed. 100 candles, a fire the length of a rowing boat, silver gleaming down the long tables, and 40 of the most important families in the north seated beneath the ancient blackened beams, waiting. They had all come for the same reason, though not one of them would have said it aloud. For a year and more the Duke of Harrowmere had shut himself away. He had refused every invitation, answered no letter, and let the whole county wonder whether grief had unmade him entirely. Now at last he had summoned them. An announcement, the whispers ran. A betrothal, surely. An heir, proof that the great house of Harrowmere would go on. At the head of the hall sat the Duke himself. Emeric of Harrowmere was not yet 35, but sorrow had carved him older. He was tall and spare, dark-haired, with a face like the northern country itself, handsome, cold, and difficult to read. He wore black, as he had worn black for a year. His long fingers rested unmoving on the arm of his chair, and his gaze traveled the room slowly, weighing each guest as though he were counting old debts. Apart from the others, near the fire, sat one old woman who did not fidget or gossip. Lady Morwenna, the Duke's great-aunt, sharp-eyed and straight-backed at 80, watched her nephew with the patience of a woman who had known him since the hour of his birth and trusted none of his silences. The steward, Deverell, moved among the tables, smooth, attentive, refilling a glass here, murmuring a courtesy there. Nothing in that room escaped him, least of all his master's face. At last the Duke rose. The hall fell quiet so suddenly that the great fire seemed to roar. Cups were set down. Every eye turned to him. This was the moment they had waited a year to see. "My friends," Emeric said. His voice was low, but it carried to the farthest corner. "You have traveled a long way in poor weather, and you have been patient with a man who has given you little cause for patience. You came, I think, expecting me to name a bride." A ripple of knowing smiles moved down the tables. Somewhere a mother pressed her daughter's hand. "I will not," he said. The smiles faltered. "Instead," the Duke went on, "I mean to settle a question that has troubled this house for many months, a question not one of you can answer, but one person beneath this roof can." He turned to his steward. "Deverell, go down to the North Chapel. There is a girl there who lights a candle every night at the tomb of my sister." He paused, and for the first time in a year, something flickered behind his eyes. Not grief exactly, but something sharper, older, more alive. "Bring her to me. Bring me the girl with the candle." For one long heartbeat, no one moved. Then the hall broke into a low storm of murmurs. A girl? A servant? Here, before the assembled peerage of the North. They had come for a duchess, and he was sending for a candle-maid. The great families exchanged glances that said plainly what they dared not speak aloud. The grief had done its work at last. The Duke's mind had slipped its moorings. An old earl, near the hearth, leaned to his neighbor, and did not trouble to lower his voice. "He has made a mistake," he said heavily. "A year shut up alone with his ghosts, and now this. Mark me, the man is not himself." All down the long tables, heads nodded in grave agreement. They had ridden through the snow to witness the rebirth of one of the oldest houses in the North. Instead, they were certain they were watching its master quietly come undone. "Your Grace," said the steward carefully, and there was something new beneath his smoothness now, something watchful. "The girl is only a servant, a nobody. Surely on such a night, before such company—" "I know what she is," Emeric said. "Better than you do, I think. Fetch her." Deverell bowed. But as he straightened, his eyes flicked, quick and against his will, toward a guest seated near the middle of the hall, a broad, well-fed man in claret velvet, who had gone very still over his wine. Only Lady Morwenna saw it. and she filed it away in her long memory. The steward left. The great doors boomed shut behind him, and the sound rolled through the hall like distant thunder. And so it began, though not one soul in that bright, warm room understood what the Duke had set in motion. They saw a grieving lord humiliating himself over a servant's ghost story and a scullery girl. They saw a mistake. They did not know that the girl now rising from her knees in the freezing chapel below, a guttering candle cupped in her raw red hands, carried a secret that could ruin half the great names seated at those very tables. They did not know that she had come to Velmont for one reason only in all the world, and that the man who had destroyed her life was seated at that very moment as a guest of honor at the Duke's own table. Out in the dark, the footsteps drew nearer. To understand why a grieving duke would set aside the flower of the northern nobility for a servant girl, you must go back some months, to the first night the light appeared. Velmont Hall was older than the family that held it, and the oldest part of all was the North Chapel, a squat, cold building of gray stone, joined to the main house by a long covered walk. For 12 generations the family had been laid to rest there, and a little over a year ago, they had carried Lady Aveline into it. Aveline had been the Duke's only sister, younger than him by 7 years, bright where he was grave, quick to laugh where he was slow even to speak. She had been the living warmth of Velmont. And then, in the space of one hard winter, a fever had taken her, and the warmth had gone out of the house as surely as breath goes out of a body. Emmerich had not set foot in the chapel since the day of her funeral. He had ordered it locked. Grief, in him, did not weep or rage. It froze. He buried himself in the running of the estate, in ledgers and leases and the 1,000 cold duties of a great house, and he did not speak his sister's name aloud, not once, in all that year. Then, one night in autumn, a housemaid crossing the yard looked up and screamed. There was a light in the north chapel window, a single small flame steady in the dark, where no flame had any business being. The chapel was locked. The only key hung in the steward's room, and yet night after night the light returned, a candle burning quite alone behind the old warped glass. Long after the household had gone to bed, the servants would not go near it. They crossed themselves and hurried past the covered walk with their eyes fixed on their shoes. Lady Aveline had come back, the bolder ones whispered, come back to grieve for her own short, unfinished life. The chapel light, they called it, an omen, a haunting. Whatever it was no business of the living. But it was not a ghost. It was a girl named Nell. She had come to Velmont only that summer, a quiet, plain-seeming girl in a servant's gray, taken on as an under-housemaid on false papers, and a soft, careful story of having no family left in the world. She kept apart. She did her work without complaint. And when the great house slept, she lifted the stolen key from its hook, crossed the freezing walk, and let herself into the chapel where Lady Aveline lay. There she lit her candle. And there, in the flickering dark, she did a strange thing for a servant girl. She did not pray. She searched. She would kneel at the cold marble, not with folded hands, but with her fingers moving along the carved letters of the tomb, along the seams of the old oak paneling behind it, feeling, always feeling, for something the household did not know was there. And now and then, she would speak very low to the dead woman in the stone. "You believed him," she would murmur. "You were the only one who ever did. So it has to be here. It has to be." What the servants took for a haunting was a hunt. What they took for a ghost was a girl looking for something she valued more than her own life. And every night, from a high window in the east wing, one man watched that small, stubborn flame, and could not look away. The Duke had learned the truth of the light within a fortnight. He was not a man easily fooled by ghost stories. He knew it was the new maid. He knew she came each night and lingered far too long for simple piety. A wiser master, a colder one, would have had her turned out into the snow for the theft of the key alone. Emmerich had not, because there was one thing he could not explain. even to himself. In a whole year of frozen silence, the only warmth he had felt, the only thing that had made him rise from his chair and cross to the glass with something like feeling stirring in his chest, was the sight of that little light burning steadily for his sister when he himself could not bear to enter the room where she lay. Whoever she was, this girl mourned Aveline, and in all the vast cold house, she was the only living soul who did. So he had watched and wondered and said nothing until tonight. Tonight, before the whole assembled North, he had finally sent for her. He did not yet know himself what he was reaching for. He knew only that the girl with the candle was the single unanswered question in a house full of dead answers, and that he could not go on another night without knowing why a stranger wept for a sister who was not hers. He was about to find out, so were his guests. And so, though she did not yet know it, was she. Her name was not Nell. Her name was Elowen Ashcroft, and she had not been born to scrub grates and haul coal. She had been born in a tall, bright house far to the south, the only child of Dr. Thaddeus Ashcroft, one of the most celebrated astronomers of the age. Her father had been a gentle, brilliant man who cared far more for the stars than for money, and in the end it had ruined them both. For years, Ashcroft had labored over one great work, charts of the heavens so exact that a ship might sail by them and never lose her way. Learned men had crossed the sea to knock at his door. His name was spoken with respect in the academies of 3 nations. And when the work stood nearly finished, a wealthy patron came forward, offering to pay for its printing, and lay it before the Royal Society. That patron was Sir Gideon Crail. Crail was a broad, smiling man with cold eyes and a rare genius for taking what was not his. He had lent the astronomer money, a great deal of it, and drawn him gently, patiently, ever deeper into debt, all warmth and good fellowship. And then, the moment the charts were done, he had closed his hand. The charts were his, Crail announced, bought and paid for. When Ashcroft protested, Crail produced papers, forged every last one. Debts the old man could never repay, and worse, letters that seemed to prove he had stolen his life's findings from another man. A fraud, a thief, a liar, exposed. The scandal broke over them like a wave. Dr. Ashcroft's name, his labor of 20 years, his honor, all of it swept away in a single season. The charts were seized, the tall, bright house sold from under them. And the old man, broken and shamed before the whole world, did not live to see another summer. He died still whispering that the truth had been written down, kept safe, and would one day be found. Elowen was left with nothing. No money, no name worth the having, no proof of anything at all. Only a few coins, her mother's locket, and a cold, steady anger that kept her alive through a year when grief alone would surely have finished her. But for a letter. It came from an old friend of her father's, a scholar, who had never once believed the charges. He remembered that, in better days, Dr. Ashcroft had written for years to a young noblewoman in the far north, a clever, warm-hearted girl with a rare passion for the stars, who had championed his name and begged, before the ruin came, to be trusted with copies of his private papers for safekeeping. Her name had been Lady Aveline of Harrowmere, and Lady Aveline, the letter said, had done far more than merely admire him. In the last months of her life she had grown quietly, fiercely certain of his innocence, and had begun, in secret, to gather the proof of it. Letters, records of Crail's debts, a specimen of the forger's own hand. Enough, perhaps, to clear a dead man's name and bring Sir Gideon Crail to the justice he had so long escaped, and then Lady Aveline had died. Suddenly. Of a fever, they said, and whatever she had gathered had died with her, hidden somewhere in the great cold house where she had lived and worked, Velmont Hall. So Elowen Ashcroft had become Nell. She had forged her references, folded away her learning and her true voice beneath a housemaid's gray, and walked in through the servants' door of the house of Harrowmere to do the one thing left to her in all the world. To find what Aveline had hidden, to clear her father's name, and to bring Sir Gideon Crail to the ruin he had earned 100 times over. That was why she lit a candle each night at the tomb of a woman she had never met, a woman who had been her father's only champion and was now her last and only hope. That was why she pressed her fingers to the cold carved stone and whispered to the dead. Aveline had believed. Aveline had hidden the truth close by. It had to be here. It simply had to be. For 3 long months she had searched and found nothing. And now she could feel her time running out like sand. And then, this night of all nights, a breathless footman had come clattering down to the chapel with an order that made no sense at all. The Duke required her, in the great hall, before every one of his guests, at once. Eloan's heart had turned to ice in her chest. A servant dragged before the assembled peerage of the North could mean one thing only: disaster. She had been discovered. After everything, it was over. But she did not yet know the true shape of the ruin waiting for her. She did not know that among the 40 great names seated at the Duke's long tables, laughing, drinking, warming their soft hands at his fire, sat a broad, smiling man in claret velvet. She did not know that Sir Gideon Crail himself, the man who had brought her father to his grave in all but name, the one man alive who would know her face the very instant he laid eyes upon it, was waiting for her in that bright and crowded hall. And the Duke had just commanded before them all that she be brought. The chapel key was still warm in her fist as she climbed the frozen stairs, up toward the light and the noise and the ruin she could not yet see. The great doors swung open, and the cold came in with her. Every head in the hall turned at once. Into the blaze of 100 candles walked a small figure in servant's gray snow, still melting in her dark hair, a burnt-out candle stub clutched forgotten in one red hand. She looked painfully young and painfully plain among all that silk and silver, and a soft ripple of amusement ran down the tables. So this was the Duke's great mystery. This was what he had set above a duchess. Eloan kept her eyes on the flagstones and made herself walk, one step, then another, down the endless aisle between the staring faces. She had spent 3 months making herself invisible, and now 40 of the most powerful people in the North were looking at nothing else. She did not let them see her fear. She had learned in 2 hard years that fear was precisely what such people fed upon. And then, halfway down the hall, she saw him. Claret velvet. A broad, easy shape lounging near the fire, a glass of the Duke's wine cradled in a soft white hand. The face above it was heavier than she remembered, the smile more comfortable, but it was the same face that had stood in a courtroom and watched her father's name burned to ash without once ceasing to smile. Sir Gideon Crail. For one terrible instant the hall tilted around her, her breath stopped. Every screaming nerve in her body told her to run or to cry out or to fly at him with her nails, and she did none of it. She fixed her eyes forward, forced her feet to keep their slow, measured pace, and buried 2 years of grief and fury so deep that not a flicker of it reached her face. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and not one soul in that room knew she had done anything at all. She reached the foot of the dais and sank into a curtsy. "Your Grace." "Look at me," the Duke said. Slowly she raised her eyes, and for the first time Eloan Ashcroft and Emeric of Harrowmere looked at one another directly. She had braced for coldness or contempt. She found neither. His dark gaze moved over her face with a strange, searching intensity, as though she were a page written in a language he had almost forgotten how to read. "You are the one who goes to the chapel at night," he said. "Who lights a candle at my sister's tomb?" It was not a question. Denial was useless. "Yes, Your Grace." A murmur ran through the hall. "By whose leave?" This was the steward, Deverell, stepping smoothly forward, his voice all wounded propriety. "The chapel is locked, Your Grace." She has stolen the key from my own room, night after night. Trespass and theft both. He turned to the guests with a small, regretful smile. These country girls will invent any tale for a little notice. I've no doubt she hoped word of the haunting would climb its way to your grace and win her some soft place, above her station. Laughter, low and knowing. It was a neat, cruel explanation, and Eloin watched the whole hall swallow it in an instant. A scheming servant. Of course, what else could she possibly be? The easy thing, the safe thing, would have been to weep, to beg pardon, to let them believe it, and be turned out with nothing worse than shame. She would keep her secret and her skin. Instead, she lifted her chin. "I took the key," she said, and her voice, clear and steady, carried farther than she intended. "That much is true, and I will answer for it. But I did not do it for a soft place, nor for anyone's notice. I did it because someone in this house ought to remember Lady Aveline, and it seemed that no one else would." The laughter died. The silence that followed was so complete that Eloin could hear the candles guttering in their sconces. She had gone too far. She knew it even as the words left her, but she could not call them back, and some fierce, reckless part of her did not wish to. The Duke's face had changed. "You never knew my sister," he said very quietly. "You came here months after she died. Why should a stranger mourn her? Because I know what she loved." Her eyes went, before she could stop them, to the family crest hung behind his chair, and the words carved beneath it, words she had read 100 times by candlelight. "Lucem secor," she said. "I follow the light." She loved the stars, your grace. She spent her nights with charts and glasses, chasing the heavens, while other ladies were at their dancing. A person who does that is not so easily forgotten. I did not think she should lie in the dark with no one to bring her a light. She had spoken the Latin without thinking, the clean, unhesitating Latin of a scholar's daughter in the mouth of a housemaid. For a long moment, no one spoke at all. The Duke was staring at her as though the floor had shifted beneath his feet. By the fire, old Lady Morwenna had set down her cup and was watching the girl with sudden, sharp attention. And Emmerich of Harrowmere, who had not felt a single thing he could name in a year, felt the first crack run silently through the ice. This was no scheming country girl. He did not know what she was. But he knew with absolute certainty that his steward was wrong. "Leave the key with Deverell when you are done with it," he heard himself say. "But you may keep your candle. My sister should not lie in the dark." The hall stirred in scandalized disbelief. Eloin barely heard it, because as she rose from her second curtsy, she made the one mistake she could not afford. Her eyes, drawn by some helpless instinct, flicked for half a heartbeat toward the man in claret velvet. And Sir Gideon Crail was no longer smiling. He had set down his glass. He was leaning forward now, his cold eyes narrowed upon her face, his heavy brow furrowed with the slow, dawning effort of a man chasing a memory he cannot quite lay his hand on. A face he has seen somewhere before, in another life, wearing a finer gown. "Girl," he said softly into the quiet, "come here a moment. Let me look at you." For one frozen breath, Eloin stood rooted, Crail's pale eyes crawling over her face. Then the Duke rose. "The girl has duties," Emmerich said, his voice flat and final, cutting clean across the hall. "Deverell, see her out. We have kept our guests from their supper long enough." Whether he had glimpsed the danger or merely tired of the spectacle, Eloin never knew, but she seized the reprieve, curtsied, and escaped the hall on legs that shook beneath her. All the way to the doors, she felt Crail's stare follow her, heavy as a hand between her shoulder blades. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark of the servants' garret with her heart hammering, and understood that everything had changed. She had come to Velmont to be no one, a shadow, a scrap of gray that no one would ever trouble to look at twice. In the space of a single hour, she had become the most talked of soul in the house. And worse, far worse, Crail had seen her, not known her, not yet, but seen her. The memory was in him now, working like a splinter beneath the skin. She had to find Aveline's proof, and quickly. And then she had to vanish. But the house would not let her move. By morning, the whole of Velmont had the story. The candle girl who had bewitched the Duke, who spoke Latin like a lady and had been rewarded for her insolence. The other servants who had ignored her for 3 months now watched her with open resentment and no small fear. She was strange. She was above herself. She was perhaps exactly the sort of creature the chapel light had always hinted at, and Mr. Deverell had been made a fool of before the entire county. The steward's revenge was quiet and thorough. Eloan found herself lifted from the ordinary rounds and set to the very worst work the great house could offer. She scoured the scullery flags until her hands split and bled. She hauled ash and coal up 6 flights in the freezing dark. She was sent to scrub the disused north kitchens alone, hour upon hour, always within sight of someone. Never once left free to slip away to the chapel or the rooms she still so desperately needed to search. It was a cage built of labor, and both she and Deverell understood precisely what it was for. She bore it, as she bore all things. In silence, her face smooth, giving him nothing. She had learned long ago that tears were the coin such men most wished to be paid in, and she would not pay. But the labor was not the worst of it. The worst was Crail. The gathering broke up over the following days, the carriages bearing the great families back down the White Avenue one by one, until at last only a single guest remained. Sir Gideon Crail had discovered, all at once, a pressing interest in certain northern investments that obliged him to impose upon the Duke's hospitality. A while longer, he took to walking the corridors. He took to appearing, soft and smiling, in doorways where he had no reason to be. And more than once, kneeling over her brush in some cold passage, Eloan looked up to find him at the far end of it, watching her with that same slow, patient, dawning frown. He was trying to remember. And she knew that sooner or later he would. Then came the blow that turned her dread to something near to panic. She was carrying linens past the morning room when she caught the Duke's voice through the half-open door, low in conversation with his housekeeper. It was time, he was saying, that the house stop living like a tomb. Lady Evelyn's rooms were to be opened, aired, and cleared. Her books, her papers, her charts, all of it packed away or given to the college she had loved. And the North Chapel was to be restored, come spring, reconsecrated, the old paneling stripped out and replaced. Eloan stood in the corridor, with the linens going cold in her arms. Whatever Aveline had hidden, whatever proof of her father's innocence lay, somewhere among those rooms behind that paneling folded into those charts would soon be scattered into crates, or carried off, or torn out and burned. 3 months of searching. And now she had, at the very most, a handful of days. She would have to take a terrible risk, and she would have to take it soon. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the risk had already been taken for her. That very afternoon, while she scrubbed the north kitchens raw, Mr. Deverell let himself quietly into the servants' garret. He had not forgotten his humiliation, and he did not believe in witches. He believed in evidence. And deep in the thin straw of the candle girl's mattress, wrapped with great care in a scrap of oilcloth, his searching fingers closed on something hard and flat. He drew it out into the light, a slender leather folder. Inside a single page, old worn soft along its folds, covered edge to edge in a fine and elegant hand, a chart of the winter stars, and beneath it, an inked signature. Thaddeus Ashcroft. Deverell did not know the name, but he knew the girl had lied about who she was, and he knew exactly which guest under this roof would pay handsomely to be told. He slid the folder inside his coat and turned his steps toward the guest wing, toward the rooms of Sir Gideon Crail. Upstairs the Duke could not settle. Long after the hall had emptied, Emeric sat alone before his fire with a book he did not read, the girl's clear voice turning over and over in his mind. I did not think she should lie in the dark. No servant spoke so. No servant looked at him so, without fear and without flattery, as though she saw the man and not the title, and found the man wanting. It was his aunt who put the thing into words. Lady Morwenna found him at his window, and stood beside him a while in silence before she spoke. "You have looked at nothing for a year, Emeric," she said quietly. "Tonight you looked at that girl as though you had woken from a long sleep. Grief is not a virtue. Your sister knew that. She would be ashamed to see what you have made of your mourning, a locked chapel, and a house that flinches at a candle." She laid a thin hand on his arm. "Leave the girl to me a while. There is more to her than a stolen key, and I mean to know what." He did not argue. That, more than anything, told her how far the ice had already cracked. And so, that same night, a footman found Elowin in the scullery, and told her that Lady Morwenna required her presence, at once and alone. Elowin's hands went still in the grey water. Of all the summonses she had feared, she had not thought of this one. Lady Morwenna kept a small, warm sitting room in the oldest wing, crowded with books and worn furniture and the good smell of wood smoke. She was seated by the fire when Elowin entered, upright as a fence post, despite her 80 years, a shawl drawn about her shoulders, her bright black eyes fixed already on the door. "Close it," she said, "and come where I can see you properly." Elowin obeyed and stood with her hands folded and her eyes lowered, every inch the servant. "You can stop that." Morwenna said dryly, "I have watched servants come and go for 60 years, child. I know how they stand, how they speak, how they hold their thoughts. You do all three of them wrong." She tilted her head. "Lucem seeker. You read it off the crest without a breath's pause, and you turned it into English like a girl who has construed Latin at her father's knee since before she could walk. No scullery maid in all of England could do that. So, let us not waste one another's time in pretending." Elowin's heart was pounding, but she held her face still. "I had a little schooling, my lady, before I was orphaned." "A little." Morwenna's mouth twitched. "Yes, and I have a little money." She let that rest a moment, and then her voice softened, and something older and sadder came into it. "Sit down, Elowin, who is not Nell. I am not your enemy, very nearly the opposite, though you have no reason yet to believe it." Reluctantly, Elowin perched on the very edge of the offered chair. Morwenna studied her a long while. "You mourn my great-niece," she said at last. "Truly mourn her. I saw it plainly in your face in that hall, and it was not performed. That interests me a great deal, because I do not believe you ever once met Aveline in life, which means you grieve her for what she did, or for what she knew, and that, child, is a very particular kind of grief." Elowin said nothing. She did not trust her voice to hold. "Let me tell you a thing about my great-niece," the old woman went on, gazing into the flames. "She had the finest mind in this family, and the family wasted it, as families do with clever girls. She loved the stars, sat up half the night at her glass, writing to scholars the length of the kingdom as though a duke's sister had any business with such men." A faint, sad smile. "And in her last months, she changed. She grew frightened, secretive. She came to me once near the end, and begged me to keep a letter safe. Then, before I could ask why, snatched it back and said it was too dangerous, that she'd not set an old woman in its path." Morwenna's black eyes lifted from the fire and settled on Elowin with a terrible directness. "And then, my dear, she was dead. A fever, they told us. A strong, healthy young woman of 26, dead in 3 short days in a house full of guests." She let the words fall one by one, like stones into a well. "I have wondered every day since what my Aveline had learned that was too dangerous to speak. And now, a year on, a girl arrives in my nephew's house under a false name, a scholar's daughter, by her Latin who weeps at that same tomb, and runs her fingers along the paneling when she thinks no one watches. Eloan's blood had turned to ice. I have not finished. Morwenna lifted one thin hand. Aveline believed a thing I have come to believe myself. She used to say there was nothing in all the world so dark it could not be understood, if only a person were brave enough to carry a light into it and look. Most people, she said softly, much prefer the dark. It asks so much less of them. My nephew has lived in it for a year. This house has lived in it far longer. There are debts under this roof that were never paid, and wrongs that were never named, and I am too old and too tired to go on pretending I cannot feel them. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to almost nothing. So I shall ask you but once, and plainly, and I will know it if you lie to me. Who are you, child? Who is it that you are truly here to mourn? And what did my Aveline die knowing? The fire cracked. The old house seemed to hold its breath. And Eloan Ashcroft, who had guarded her secret with her very life for 3 long months, opened her mouth at last to answer. We'll pause here for just a moment. If these stories mean something to you, take a second to subscribe. It's the single thing that helps us keep telling them. Now, back to the fire and the question still hanging in the air. For a long moment the only sound was the fire. Then Eloan Ashcroft did the thing she had sworn she would never do. She told the truth. It came out of her quietly at first, and then all at once, her true name, her father, the astronomer, the great charts that had been his life's labor, and the smiling man who had lent him money only to steal everything he had, his work, his honor, his very name. She told of the forged papers, of the ruin, of the grave her father had gone to with the word innocent still on his lips. And she told of the letter that had brought her north, of Lady Aveline, the one soul in the kingdom who had believed him, who had been quietly gathering the proof to clear his name when death came for her. Lady Morwenna listened without a word, her black eyes never once leaving the girl's face. When it was done, she sat very still. So, she said at last softly, not a fever after all. I have felt it for a year, and let myself be called a foolish old woman for the feeling. Her thin hands had closed into fists upon the arms of her chair. My Aveline was silenced for what she knew. And you walked into this house alone, with nothing but a false name and your father's Latin, to prove it. I have no proof of what was done to her, Eloan said, only of the theft, and I cannot even find that. Then we shall find it together. Morwenna leaned forward, urgent now. Listen to me, child, for we have little time. My nephew means to empty Aveline's rooms within the week. Whatever she hid where she loved best. Not her bedchamber, not the library, but the Old West Tower, her observatory. She spent every clear night of her life up there, among her glasses and her charts. If my great-niece meant to keep a thing safe, she kept it where she kept the heavens. The old woman's gaze was fierce as a hawk's. Go tonight, tomorrow may be too late. And Eloan, beware the steward. Beware the smiling one most of all. They have both been a great deal too interested in you. And so the trap that had been closing around Eloan for days became for one single night a door left open. She did not know that at that very hour in the guest wing, another door had opened. Mr. Nodder. Deverell stood before Sir Gideon Crail with the leather folder in his hands and watched the great man's soft face change as he drew out the star chart and read the name inked beneath it. For a moment Crail said nothing at all. Then he smiled, slow and cold and dreadful. "Ashcroft?" he murmured. "Of course, the eyes. I knew I had seen those eyes weep before." The old fraud's daughter scrubbing floors in the very house where his champion once lived. His pale eyes rose to the steward's, and something passed between the two men that had passed between them once before, a year ago, in this same house, She is looking for it, Deverell. She would not have come otherwise, which means it was never found, which means it still exists. He rose, smoothing the velvet over his belly. Watch her, he said gently. Bring me word the moment she stirs. Some things are better buried a second time, and this time, a good deal more deeply. The Old West Tower stood black against the stars. Eloan climbed the narrow spiral stair with her heart in her throat and a single candle cupped against the draught. At the top, a heavy door gave onto a wide, round room, and she caught her breath. It was a place built to chase the sky. A great brass telescope stood angled at the shuttered window. Charts papered the curving walls. A globe of the heavens, taller than a child, gleamed dully in one corner. Everything lay beneath a soft gray shroud of dust, untouched for a year, and yet the room was so full of the woman who had made it that Eloan felt, absurdly, that she ought to beg her pardon for the intrusion. Where she kept the heavens. She set to work. She searched the desk, the shelves, the frames of the charts. She ran her hands over the base of the great globe, along the cold brass of the telescope's mounting. Nothing. The candle burned lower. Far below, the house slept on. Then her fingers tracing the stone sill beneath the shuttered window. The very sill from which Aveline had watched the sky, found it. A single flagstone that rocked ever so slightly beneath her touch. Her breath stopped. She worked her nails into the seam and lifted. Beneath lay a shallow cavity, and in it, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, a slim-bound journal and a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. Loan's hands shook as she drew them out and opened the journal to its final written pages. There, in a fine and clever hand, not unlike her father's own, Aveline of Harrowmere spoke to her across the grave. I am certain of it now. The proofs against Dr. A were forgeries, and I can name the hand that made them. I have gathered enough to see GC brought to justice, or near enough. But I am watched. There is a man in this house who is not what he seems, who carries word to another. My food has twice tasted strange, I am afraid, and I trust no one beneath this roof but the stars. And then the last entry, the ink hurried and uneven. If I am right, they will come for the proof, so I have put it where none of them will think to look, and where I myself mean one day to rest. Beneath the light, in the oldest, coldest heart of this house. God keep it, and God keep the girl it was always meant for. Eloan pressed her hand to her mouth. Beneath the light, where she means to rest, the chapel. The proof lay in the chapel, hidden near the very tomb where a stranger had knelt night after night with a candle, never once dreaming she knelt upon the thing she sought. For a moment the grief of it overwhelmed her, not for herself but for the two of them, her father and this woman she had never met. Two brilliant, gentle souls who had reached toward one another across all that distance in defense of the truth, and been struck down for it. Aveline had died trying to save a stranger's name. The least Eloan could do was prove worthy of it. She wrapped the journal and the letters carefully, pressed them to her heart, and swore to the silent stone that she would not fail her. A stair creaked below her. Eloan went utterly still. The candle flame shivered. Another creak, nearer now, the slow, deliberate tread of someone climbing the tower toward her through the dark. She was not alone. There was nowhere to run. The tower had one door and one stair, and the tread was already upon it. Eloan did the only thing left to her. She thrust the journal and the letters into the bodice of her gown, pressed her back against the cold curve of the wall beside the door, and pinched out her candle. Darkness swallowed the room. Her own heartbeat was a drum in her ears. The door swung inward. A wedge of lamplight fell across the dusty floor, and Emeric of Harrowmere stepped into his dead sister's observatory. He held the lamp high, and its glow found her at once, flattened against the wall, white-faced, caught. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He had come, she would learn, for the reason he did everything of late. Because from his window he had seen a light burning where no light should be, in the tower this time, instead of the chapel, and he had not been able to keep himself from it. You, he said, His voice was very low. "In my sister's rooms, in the middle of the night." His gaze moved over the disturbed dust, the lifted flagstone, the cavity yawning open beneath the window. His jaw tightened. "I made allowances for a stolen key. This is another matter entirely. This is theft from the dead." He set the lamp down slowly. "I think you had better tell me who you truly are before I call for the constable, and let him ask you instead." It was the moment she had dreaded above all others. Every instinct she had honed in 2 years of hiding screamed at her to lie, to weep, to invent, and she was so very tired of it. So she chose the light. "My name is Eloan Ashcroft," she said. Her voice shook, and then steadied. "My father was Dr. Thaddeus Ashcroft, an astronomer. A good man, a great one. And he was destroyed, his work stolen, his name branded a lie, by the man who is at this moment sleeping under your roof as your honored guest. Sir Gideon Crail." The Duke went very still. "I did not come to steal from your sister, your grace," Eloan went on, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "I came because Lady Aveline was the only person alive who believed my father was innocent, because she was gathering the proof of it when she died. I came to finish what she began, and to clear a dead man's name before mine is forgotten too. Ashcroft." The Duke said the name slowly as though testing whether he had heard it before. "The astronomer. There was a scandal. 2 years ago, perhaps 3. A great man exposed as a cheat, his life's charts proven stolen. It was spoken of even here in the north." His eyes narrowed. "And you would have me believe that was a lie. That Sir Gideon Crail, who has dined in half the great houses of England, is a common forger and a thief." "I would have you believe your sister," Eloan said. "You expect me to believe." "I expect nothing." She drew the journal from her bodice with trembling hands and held it out to him. "But this is her hand, not mine. Read it. Read what your sister wrote in the last weeks of her life. And then tell me I am a thief." For a moment he did not take it. Then he did. Eloan watched his face by lamplight as he read. She watched the anger drain from it, and something far worse move in behind, watched him reach the lines about the strange taste in the food, the man in the house who was not what he seemed, the fear. She saw the great cold Duke of Harrowmere, who had not wept in a year, grip the little book until his knuckles whitened, and read it a second time and a third, as though he could make the words say something kinder if only he stared hard enough. She had come into this room braced to be handed to the constable, and instead she found herself watching a proud man's whole world quietly break apart. She knew that grief. She had lived inside it for 2 years. And though he was a duke and she was nothing, in that moment she felt for him only a terrible, unlooked-for tenderness. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright and terrible. "A fever," he said hoarsely. "They told me it was a fever. I sat in this house and let them tell me my sister died of a fever." He turned away, one hand pressed to his mouth, his shoulders shaking. She was frightened. She was frightened, and alone, and she wrote it down, and I never came. I locked her rooms, and I never once looked. Eloan did something then that she had not planned, that no maid ought ever to do to a duke. She crossed the room and laid her hand upon his arm. "You are looking now," she said softly. He turned, and for a moment, that had nothing to do with rank or station. They simply saw one another, the grieving brother who had failed his sister, and the grieving daughter who had failed to save her father, 2 people who had each carried an unbearable thing alone, meeting at last in the ruin of a room built to study the light. He looked down at her hand upon his sleeve, a housemaid's hand, red and roughened, that he had watched wring out a scrubbing cloth a dozen times without ever once seeing the person it belonged to. He had passed her in his corridors, given her curt nods, let his steward grind her down to nothing, and never so much as asked her name. Shame moved through him, slow and cold. "I did not see you," he said. All these months you were under my roof carrying this alone, and I never once looked. You are looking now, she said again. And this time, it was not comfort, but something nearer to forgiveness. And he felt it land somewhere in him that had been frozen a very long time. We will finish it, Emeric said. His voice had changed. The grief was still there, but beneath it now ran something hard as forged iron. Whatever my sister began, we will finish it, you and I. Crail will answer for your father. And, by God, he will answer for Aveline. He looked at the open cavity, at the ribboned letters still in her hand. Where is the rest of it? She writes of proof. I know where it is, Eloin said. She hid the whole of it in the one place. None of them would think to look. She told me in the last line, beneath the light. Your Grace, it is in the chapel. It has been beneath my candle all along. Emeric's eyes met hers, alight now with a fierce and sudden hope. But even as he opened his mouth to answer, a sound reached them both from the foot of the tower stair. The soft, unmistakable scuff of a shoe on stone, quickly withdrawn. They were not the only ones who had climbed the tower that night, and whoever had been listening at the door had heard every word, including the last. Emeric was at the stair in 3 strides, but the dark below was empty. Whoever had listened had fled on soft and practiced feet, and the great sleeping house had swallowed him whole. They heard, Eloin whispered. They heard where it is. Then we move tonight. The Duke's mind, long dulled by grief, had come suddenly and coldly awake. But first I will know the name of the man who has been carrying my secrets out of this house like a rat carrying grain. Aveline wrote of a spy, one who was here a year ago when she died, and is here still. His mouth was a hard line. There is only one servant who has served me that long and had the run of every room. Come. They moved through the sleeping house like 2 ghosts. The lamp shuddered low against the dark. Eloin's mind was reeling. An hour ago, she had been a hunted secret, a gray nothing, scrubbing floors on borrowed time. Now she walked at a duke's side with his lost sister's journal pressed against her heart, toward a reckoning she could scarcely believe was real. He did not take her to the chapel. He took her with the lamp held high and his hand never far from her shoulder, down through the silent house to the steward's own room, and there he did not knock. He opened the door on Mr. Jatter. Deverell, fully dressed at that dead hour, hastily folding a paper into his coat, the steward's face, when he saw the 2 of them together, told its own tale. Your Grace, you listened at the tower door just now, Emeric said. It was not a question. You have been listening at doors in this house for a very long time, I think. On whose behalf? Deverell drew himself up, reaching for the old smooth confidence. Your Grace, I don't know what this creature has told you, but she is a proven liar, a girl who came here under a false. Her name is Eloin Ashcroft, and I know precisely who she is. The Duke stepped closer, and something in his quiet fury made the steward flinch. What I do not yet know is who you are, so I will tell you what will happen, Deverell. You will tell me everything. This instant, or I will have you held for questioning by the magistrate, and I will make it my personal business to see you answer for it, beside whoever it is you serve. Choose. Now. For a moment Deverell held on. Eloin could see the calculation moving behind his eyes, the old habit of a man who had talked his way out of 100 tight corners, reaching for one smooth denial more. He drew breath to try, but then his gaze fell to the journal in Eloin's hands, his dead mistress's own hand, risen up out of the grave to accuse him, and something in him simply gave way. The steward's composure cracked like ice on a pond. He was a coward in the end, as such men so often are, and cowards, cornered, will sell anyone at all to save their own skins. It came out of him in a rush. Yes, he was Crail's man, had been for years. Crail had bought his debts and owned him body and soul, and had placed him at Velmont for one purpose: to watch. To watch, in particular, the Duke's clever sister, who corresponded with too many scholars and asked too many dangerous questions about a certain astronomer. "She wrote to your father, miss, for years," Devereux said, not daring to lift his eyes to Elowen. "Thought the world of him. And when the scandal broke, she never believed a word of it. She started digging, quiet-like, into where Sir Gideon's money came from and where it went. He has interests he'd not want the crown to see. Miss, her ladyship was clever. Too clever by half. She got close. And when Lady Aveline had grown certain of the truth, when she had begun to write the letters that might have destroyed his master, Devereux stopped. His face had gone gray. "Finish it," the Duke said, in a voice like the grave. "Sir Gideon came to visit," the steward whispered. "A year ago, in the winter. He brought a physic for her ladyship's nerves," he said. "He bade me see that she took it, every day. I did not know, I swear before God I did not fully know what it would. He was weeping now, ugly and undone. In 3 days, she was dead. And he told me that if I ever breathed a word, I would answer for it alongside him, for it was my own hand that carried the cup to her door." He swallowed, and his voice dropped to a wretched whisper. "And tonight, God forgive me, when I heard the girl name the hiding place, I woke him. I told Sir Gideon where her ladyship had hidden it. Not a quarter of an hour ago. He may have it in his hands already." Silence fell in the little room, absolute and dreadful. Elowen could not breathe. She watched the Duke's face and saw upon it the exact moment a man's last illusion dies. The moment Emeric of Harrowmere understood, past all doubt, that his sister's death had been no illness at all, that she had been quietly done away with by degrees in her own home, by a smiling guest and a trusted servant, while he sat in his library not 50 feet away, and called his silent strength. For the space of several heartbeats the Duke did not move at all. His face was a mask. Elowen could not tell what he would do, whether he would strike the man, or weep, or simply come apart where he stood. He put out one hand and steadied himself against the door frame. When at last he spoke, his voice had gone strange and quiet, almost gentle, which was somehow far worse than any shout. "She was 26, he said to no one at all. She used to leave her charts scattered all over my desk, and laugh when I complained of it. She called me an old man at 30. His eyes closed. "And I let a smiling stranger bring her that cup in her own room 3 days running. And I buried her, and I called it the will of God." Then he turned to Elowen, and his voice, when it came again, was terrifyingly calm. "The chapel," he said. "Now, if we are not already too late." He looked back at the shaking steward one last time. "You will remain in this room. A footman will be at your door. You have just confessed to your part in her death, Devereux, and the only road left open to you now runs through telling that same tale to a magistrate at dawn." They went swiftly then, the Duke taking Elowen by the arm through the dark passages toward the north wing. Neither of them spoke. Elowen's heart hammered with a wild, impossible hope that the proof was still there, still waiting that they had reached it. First, the covered walk was black and bitterly cold. The chapel loomed up out of the dark. And even before they came to it, she knew with a sick lurch that something was wrong. For the door stood open, and the cold flagstone before Lady Aveline's tomb, the very stone Elowen had knelt upon 100 nights, weeping, searching, bringing her light, had already been prized up and cast aside. The hollow beneath it was empty. For a moment, Elowen simply stared into the dark, gaping hole in the floor. She had knelt upon that stone 100 nights. She had wept there. She had run her fingers along its edges, never once dreaming what lay beneath. And now, on the very night she had learned the truth of it, someone had reached it before her by a matter of minutes. The candle trembled so badly in her hand that the shadows lurched and reeled across the marble face of the tomb. they were too late. Someone had come for the proof before them. And in the dark of the great house, a smiling man in claret velvet already held Eloin's every hope in his soft white hands. Eloin sank to her knees on the cold stone. 3 months, 2 years. Her father's name, her every hope gone, in the hour she had finally found it. "It's over," she whispered. "He has it. He has all of it." But the Duke was not looking at the empty hollow. He was looking at the tomb, at the carved marble likeness of his sister, at the words cut beneath her folded hands, Lus sim sequor, and a strange expression had come over his face. "My sister," he said slowly, "was cleverer than any of us. Cleverer than Crail. Cleverer than me." He knelt beside Eloin and pointed to the journal still clutched in her hand. "Read me the last line again." Her exact words. Eloin's voice trembled. "I have put it where none of them will think to look, and where I myself mean one day to rest." "Where she means to rest," Emeric repeated. "Not beneath the floor before her tomb. Within it." He rose and crossed to the effigy, and his hands found the seam where the carved coverlet met the marble base. A join so fine that only a brother who had grieved at this stone for a year could have known it was there. She had this made in her last months. She oversaw every inch of it herself. "I thought it was a morbid whim. I thought," his voice caught, "help me." Together they pressed. Stone grated on stone. A narrow drawer, cunningly hidden in the base of the tomb, slid open, and inside, dry and safe and whole, lay a thick portfolio of papers. What Crail had prized from beneath the floor was a decoy, a bundle of blank sheets in an oilcloth, left to satisfy a searcher in a hurry. The true proof Aveline had sealed inside her own memorial, trusting that the one place her enemies would never think to disturb was the resting place of the woman they had killed. Eloin let out a sound that was half a sob and half a broken laugh. Clever, brave Aveline. She had known she was going to die. She must have known it. In those last frightened weeks, and rather than save her own life, she had spent her failing strength building a hiding place inside her own grave, and trusting that one day the right soul would come along who was brave enough and gentle enough to go looking. Eloin opened the portfolio with shaking hands, and the lamp lit up the truth entire. Crail's own letters commissioning the forgeries, the forger's drafts, and the finished lies laid side by side in the same guilty hand. The record of debts manufactured out of nothing, and folded at the very back a letter in Aveline's own writing. Ad addressed to whoever loves the truth enough to look. Eloin turned the pages with reverent, trembling fingers. Every accusation that had ruined her father, every lie that had hounded him into his grave, lay here, laid open, and beside each lie in the same guilty hand its making. It was not merely enough to clear him. It was enough to bury Crail entirely. Her father was innocent, and here at last was the proof that could tell the world so. Emeric looked at her across the open portfolio, and for the first time since she had known him, something like warmth broke over his severe face. Not the almost smile she had glimpsed once or twice, but the real thing, weary and astonished and glad. "Your father will have his name back, Eloin Ashcroft," he said quietly. "I swear it to you. I swear it to you. On my sister's grave, I swear it." For one fragile moment, kneeling together in the candlelight beside the tomb of the woman who had saved them both, they let themselves simply breathe. It did not last. "How touching," said a soft voice from the chapel door. Sir Gideon Crail stood upon the threshold, and he was not alone. Behind him crowded half the roused household, the housekeeper in her nightcap, footmen with lanterns, sleepy and frightened faces pressing at the dark. Crail had woken the house, and Crail was smiling. "Your Grace, I am glad the whole household is here to witness this," he said smoothly, stepping into the chapel. "For I fear you have been most cruelly deceived. This girl is no maid at all. She is an impostor who entered your house under a false name, as your own steward will attest. She has stolen your keys, defiled your sister's tomb with her own hands, and now she produces a bundle of papers conveniently in the dark and calls them proof. He spread his soft hands wide to the gathered crowd, the very picture of wounded reason. I ask you all, I ask any honest person here, who is the more likely forger? A knight of good name and long standing? Or a proven liar, a thief, a scheming creature who has spent 3 months worming her way into a grieving man's trust? A murmur ran through the crowd, uneasy and turning. Aloan saw it happen, saw the doubt take root, saw the frightened servants look at her strange secret face and remember every whispered word about the witch in the chapel light. Crail had turned the whole thing inside out in the space of a single breath. The proof in her hands was now the proof of her guilt. Look at her, he pressed, warming to it, playing on the frightened faces as a musician plays his instrument. A girl who has lied to every soul in this house for 3 months, who forged the very references that carried her through the servant's door. Is it so great a leap to think she would forge a few pages more, in the dark, over a dead woman's tomb? A servant near the back murmured. Another slowly nodded. And? The tide was running against her, and running fast. They thought once that you had made a mistake, Your Grace, Crail said very gently, driving the knife home, bringing a candle made before the peerage of the North. I beg you, do not prove them right. Give the girl and her forgeries to me, and let me spare you the shame of it. Every eye in the chapel turned to the Duke, and Emeric of Harrowmere said nothing at all. We'll stop here for just a breath. If you're still with us, and I hope with all my heart that you are, take a moment to subscribe so the next story can find you too. Now back to the chapel, and the silence, and a smiling man who thinks he has already won. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Then the Duke of Harrowmere began, very quietly, to laugh, a low, cold sound with no mirth in it at all, and it froze the smile on Sir Gideon Crail's face. You have made one mistake, Sir Gideon, the Duke said. You have assumed that these papers are the only proof in this room. They are not. The greatest proof is that I found them, I, Emeric of Harrowmere, in my own house, guided by my own sister's hand, with my aunt, Lady Morwenna, to bear me witness. Not the girl. Me he let that settle over the crowd like snow. So when you stand in my chapel and cry forgery, understand what you are truly saying. You are not calling a maid a liar. You are calling your host one. Choose your next words with very great care. A forger, Emeric said. He rose to his full height, the portfolio in his hand. Yes, let us speak of forgers. Let us speak of a man who lent an honest scholar money the way a spider lends a fly the freedom of its web, and who, when the great work was done, produced papers out of the air, debts that were never owed, confessions that were never made, in a hand that was never the scholar's, watching household. You ask who is the likelier forger. I will show you. Bring the lamp. He laid the portfolio open upon his sister's tomb, and one by one he held the pages to the light. Crail's own letters, in Crail's own hand, instructing the forger, the drafts, the finished lies. Here is the commission. Here is the forger's practice. Here, in the margin, are Sir Gideon's own notes on how thoroughly to blacken a dead man's name. His voice rang against the stone. These were not written tonight, in the dark, by a frightened girl. These were written years ago, by the man standing in that doorway, and hidden here, in this chapel, by my sister, who died for gathering them. He held up a single sheet for the nearest guest to see. Here is a letter, sealed with Sir Gideon's own ring, a ring I have watched upon his hand at my own table, instructing a man in Southwark to manufacture debts and confessions in the name of Dr. Ashcroft, and offering 50 guineas for the work. 50 guineas, he said, to destroy a living man's honor. He lifted another and another. Here is that same forger's first clumsy attempt, and his practiced third, the slow growth of a lie, until it was smooth enough to deceive a court and break an honest man's heart. All around the chapel, the shamed faces had begun to change. They were leaning in now, beginning, at last, to understand. Creel's smile was gone now. "Lies," he said, but the word came out thin. "The girl planted. My sister planted them." Emmerich's voice cracked like a whip. "In her own tomb, with her own hands, because she was afraid, and she was right to be." He drew Aveline's journal from Alowan's grasp and held it aloft. "Her hand? Ask anyone here who served her. She writes that she was watched, that her food tasted strange, that a man in this house was carrying her secrets to another." He turned. "Shall I tell them the rest, Sir Gideon? Or shall my steward, at a sign from the Duke?" A footman brought Deverell to the chapel door, grey, trembling, ruin. And there, before the whole assembled household, the steward wept out his confession a second time. The years in Creel's pay, the watching, the cup of physic, carried faithfully to a healthy young woman's room every day for 3 days, until she died. "I will speak to that." The voice came clear and hard from the chapel door. Lady Morwenna, a shawl thrown over her nightgown, came slowly through the parting crowd upon her stick, her black eyes fixed on Creel like 2 driven nails. "My great-niece came to me in her last weeks and told me she was afraid. She would not say of what. I told her she was fanciful. I have carried the shame of that for a year." She turned to face the gathered household. "She was not fanciful. She was the bravest soul this family ever produced, and that man in the doorway had her silenced for it. I am 80 years old. I will swear to what I have heard tonight before God and before any magistrate in England, and I will not be moved." The crowd's murmur had changed entirely now. It was no longer turning against Alowan. It was turning, with a low and growing horror, upon the smiling man in the doorway, who was no longer smiling. "You took her life," Emmerich said, and the terrible calm broke at last. His voice shook with a grief a year deep. "You sat at my table, you drank my wine, you took my sister's life under this very roof, and then you came back. You came back to my house and warmed your hands at my fire and called yourself my friend." Creel's smooth mask had fallen away altogether now, and what lay beneath it was not remorse, but the raw, animal fury of a cornered thing. "She should have minded her charts," he spat, every ounce of pretense gone, prying into the affairs of her betters. "I gave your family every chance to let it lie. She would not." A horrified gasp swept round the chapel. He had all but confessed to the whole of it before them all. His pale eyes swung to Alowan, glittering with hate. "And you! You are your father over again. All that cleverness and not the wit to know when you are beaten." For 1 heartbeat, Elowen thought the Duke would strike him down. His whole body was drawn taut as a bowstring, and no one in that chapel would have lifted a finger to stop him. Creel saw it too, and Creel, cornered at last, did the only thing left to a man like him. He bolted, shoving through the crowd toward the dark of the corridor, quick and desperate for all his bulk. He did not reach it. 2 footmen and the blacksmith's broad son had him by the arms before he had gone 10 feet, and they held him fast while he thrashed and swore. The sight of it struck Elowen as almost unreal. For 2 years, Creel had loomed in her mind, vast as a mountain, invincible, untouchable. And here he was, a fat, frightened man pinned like a poacher by a blacksmith's boy, brought low at last, not by an army, but by one dead woman's cleverness and one living girl's refusal to give up. Emeric of Harrowmere stood over him, and for a long moment the whole house held its breath to see what he would do. "No," the Duke said at last, and the word was for himself as much as for the man on the floor. He lowered the fist. He had not known he'd raised, no, You will not fall here in the dark, with no one to see, the way you left her to. You will be given to the magistrate at first light. You will be tried in the open, before the whole county, for forgery, for theft, and for the unlawful death of Lady Aveline of Harrowmere. And every soul in the north will know precisely what you are." He turned his back on him. "That is not vengeance, Crail. That is the thing you have spent your whole life escaping. That is justice, and it has found you at last." They took Crail away, and in the sudden quiet, the Duke turned to the small gray figure still kneeling by the tomb, and held out his hand to help her rise. But before them all, he did not say "maid," and he did not say "no." "This is Elowen Ashcroft," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the chapel. "Daughter of Dr. Stay, Thaddeus Ashcroft, a great and honest man wronged by that creature, and cleared this night in the sight of you all. She came into my house with nothing but her courage and her father's name to save. She has more honor in her than the whole of the peerage that laughed at her in my hall." He looked around at the shamed and staring faces. "You will remember it." Elowen rose on trembling legs. "And the tears she had held back for 2 long years, through her father's ruin, through his grave, through a year of hunger and hiding and cold, broke at last, and fell freely down her face. She was not weeping from grief. She was weeping because for the first time since she was a girl, she was standing in a room full of people as herself, with nothing left in all the world to hide. Somewhere in the crowd, a housemaid who had scorned her for 3 months was weeping openly. And Elowen let them all see her at last, not the sly witch of their whispers, not the meek gray nothing who scrubbed their floors, but a grieving daughter who had crossed a kingdom for the simple, stubborn love of one good man's name. The Duke was still holding her hand. He had not once let it go. Above them, in her marble stillness, Lady Aveline seemed almost to smile. Lucem Seeker. Someone had carried a light into the dark at last. And looked. Spring came late to the north that year. But when it came all at once. The frozen fells softened into green. The long avenue that had once carried carriages through the snow now ran gold with the light of long evenings, and Velmont Hall, which had stood so long like a great gray tomb above the valley, seemed slowly to remember that it had once been a home. Much had changed in the months since the longest night. Sir Gideon Crail had been tried before the assizes, as the Duke had promised, in the full and pitiless light of day. The forged papers, Lady Aveline's journal, the confession of a broken steward. It had all come out, every last black thread of it, and the county that had once dined at Crail's table now could not speak his name without a shudder. Deverell, who had turned his evidence and wept his true remorse, had been spared the worst of it, but not the shame. He had been dismissed from Velmont and from the north entirely, to live out his days a small and haunted man. And the name of Dr. Thaddeus Ashcroft, astronomer, scholar, honest man, had been restored to its full honor. His stolen charts were recovered from Crail's estate and laid at last before the Royal Society, where the learned men who had once turned their backs pronounced them a work of genius and had them printed under his own name, that ships for 100 years might sail by them and never lose their way. Somewhere, Elowen liked to think, her father was no longer whispering innocent into the dark. Somewhere, he had been heard. She had not left Velmont. The Duke had offered, of course, to see her established anywhere she wished. A house of her own, an income, her freedom. She was a gentlewoman again, with her name and her father's legacy restored. She need never scrub another flagstone as long as she lived. But when he had made the offer, standing awkward and formal in the library with his eyes not quite meeting hers, she had understood that he was hoping, with all the clumsiness of a man who had forgotten how, that she would refuse. So she had refused. For there was work at Velmont that only she could do. High in the old West Tower, Aveline's observatory had been swept and mended and thrown open to the sky once more. The great brass telescope was polished, the charts were catalogued, and Aloan Ashcroft, who had learned the heavens at her father's knee, took up the work that Aveline had loved and a ruined man had mastered, and made it live again. She was the keeper of the light now. The household said so, and no longer with fear. The strange candle girl who had once been whispered of as a witch was now the mistress of the tower, and the servants who had once scorned her now brought their children to her on clear nights to see the rings of Saturn through the great glass. She hung her father's portrait there, on the wall where the evening light fell best. The chapel, too, had changed. It had been restored as the Duke once promised, but not into a place to be feared and locked away. Its windows had been mended to let in the sun, and its door now stood open to any who wished to sit a while with the family's dead. Aloan still lit a candle there some evenings, at the tomb of the woman she had never met and would never stop loving. But she lit it now, in the open and unafraid, and often she was not alone when she did, for Emmerich came with her. He was much changed. The Duke of Harrowmere, the black coats had been put away. The deep lines that grief had cut around his mouth had begun at last to soften. He smiled. Now rarely still, and always as if it surprised him. But it was real, and Aloan had come to treasure each one as she had once treasured a single flame in a dark window. They had come to love one another slowly, in the way of two people who had each been broken, and had each learned to be careful. A shared look across the long dinner table, a book left open at a marked page, a walk down through the parkland in the blue of the evening. Neither had spoken of it. It had grown between them quiet and sure, like light before a dawn. It was on such an evening, at the top of the tower, with the first stars pricking out above the fells, that he finally did. "When I sent for you that night," he said, watching her adjust the great telescope, "before the whole peerage of the North, they were certain I had made a mistake. Do you remember? I remember thinking they were right," she said, smiling. "I was quite sure you had lost your mind." "They have been proven wrong about a great many things," Emmerich said. "But about that most of all." He came to stand beside her at the window, and for once his formality had quite deserted him. "I have been a slow man, Aloan. Slow to see, slow to feel, slow to wake, but I am done being slow." He took her hand, there, beneath the whole turning sky. "I did not send for a maid that night. I did not even know it then. But I was sending for the person who would bring the light back into this house, and into me. I have no wish to spend a single night of the rest of my life without it." "Without you," he drew a breath. "Stay. Not as my curator, not as my guest, as my wife, as the Duchess of Harrowmere." Aloan Ashcroft looked at the grieving man who had learned to see, and at the tower full of stars that Aveline had left them, and at the small warm candle burning steady on the sill. "I followed a light into the dark of this house," she said softly, "and I never once expected to find one waiting for me." "Lucem Sikor?" Emmerich. Her eyes were shining. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He did not kiss her at once. It was not his way. He only lifted her hand and held it against his heart, and the two of them stood together at the window as the last gray left the sky, while below them the great house, so long a place of silence and locked doors and secret grief, filled slowly, room by room, with light. And so the girl with the candle, whom the whole world had once mistaken for a nobody and a fraud, came home at last, not because a truth was handed to her, but because she had been brave enough to carry a light into the darkest place she could find, and look, and refuse to look away, until the whole of it was seen.